Liberalism, section Absolute Power and the Community Obligations of the Slave Owners. From Constant onwards, modern or liberal liberty has been described and celebrated as the undisturbed enjoyment of private property. But slave owners were in fact subject to a whole series of public obligations. There can be no doubt that the Glorious Revolution and then the American Revolution consecrated the self-government of a civil society composed of, and hegemonized by, slave owners, who were more determined than ever not to tolerate interference by central political power and the church. But it would be mistaken to equate the self-government of civil society, now freed from these fetters, with the free movement of the individual members composing it. Certainly, they could reduce the slaves they legitimately owned to chattels. In the New England of 1732, a master put up for sale a 19-year-old female slave along with her son of 6 months. They could be acquired, the advert announced, quote, together or separately. There were no obstacles to bringing to market even adulterous offspring. A New Jersey master did this with the offspring of his relations with 3 black women whom he owned. Not by chance, slaves were frequently given names usually reserved for dogs and horses. There can be no doubt that the slave master wielded absolute power over his legitimate, quote, property, but not to the extent of being able freely to challenge the process of reification and commodification that had occurred. In this case, the community requirement prevailed of keeping the barrier between the race of masters and the race of servants clear and fixed. Let us attend to de Tocqueville. Blacks had been, quote, forbidden, under severe penalties, to be taught to read or write. The prohibition aimed to exclude the race of servants from any form of education, which was regarded as a serious source of danger, not only because it was liable to fuel unacceptable hopes and claims, but also because it risked facilitating the communication of ideas and sentiments between blacks that was to be frustrated by any means. And yet, in the case of violation of such rules, to be struck in the first instance were white property owners, who thus saw their negative liberty seriously restricted. The bans affecting slaves did not leave their masters unaffected. After Nat Turner's rebellion, it became a crime in Georgia even to provide a slave with paper and writing materials. Particularly significant was the legislation that banned interracial sexual relations and marriages. Later, in 1896, when upholding the constitutional legitimacy of provisions for racial segregation as a whole, the U.S. Supreme Court conceded that the ban on, quote, the intermarriage of the 2 races might, in a technical sense, breach freedom of contract, but extricated itself from an awkward situation by adding that the right of any individual state to legislate in this area was, quote, universally recognized. In fact, opposition was not lacking. The provision made in Virginia at the start of the 18th century, according to which not only those directly responsible for the sexual or marital relation were to be punished, was significant. Extremely severe penalties were prescribed for the priest guilty of having consecrated the interracial family bond. And hence, along with freedom of contract, religious freedom itself was in some sense affected. The absolute power exercised over black slaves ended up having negative and even dramatic consequences for whites. Take Pennsylvania in the early decades of the 18th century. The free black caught violating the ban on miscegenation, as it later came to be called, risked being sold as a slave. This involved serious consequences for the white woman, who had to suffer forced separation from her partner and the terrible punishment inflicted on him. Let us now see what happened in colonial Virginia immediately after the Glorious Revolution. On the basis of a law of 1691, a free white woman who had a child by a black man or mulatto could be sentenced to 5 years of servitude, and, above all, be forced to surrender the child to the parish, which then sold him or her as a servant for a term of 30 years. But there is more. Well-nigh insurmountable obstacles were placed in the way of recognition of the offspring of a relationship between an owner and one of his slaves. The father faced a tragic alternative, either to suffer exile from Virginia with his de facto family, or to agree to the child being a slave together with the mother. More summary was New York's legislation, which automatically converted all children born of a slave mother into slaves. We thus find ourselves in the presence of a society that in fact exercised such severe duress over its privileged members, partly legal and partly social, as to choke even the most natural feelings. As has been justly noted, in enslaving, quote, their children and their children's children, white people were in fact, quote, enslaving themselves. Further to clarify the entanglement between the individual property owner's absolute power over his human livestock and his subservience to the, quote, master race of which he was a member, we can offer a final consideration. We have already noted the law in force in Virginia, whereby it was meaningless to define and treat the killing of a slave by his owner as a felony. Yet, in not a few states, on the basis of legislation that survived even after the Second World War, see below, Chapter 10, a white man who had sexual relations with a black woman was guilty of a felony. Thus it was permissible for an owner to flog and beat his female slave to the point of killing her. Property right was sacred, but so strong was the control exercised by the class of property owners and the community of the free over their individual members, that only by exposing himself to risks of various kinds could he have sexual relations with her. Other than by legal provisions, the ban on miscegenation was enforced by the intervention in the 1850s, here and there, of vigilante gangs, engaged in spying on, intimidating, and attacking whites, tempted by the fascination of their female slaves and women of color in general. While in one respect they were a form of property and a chattel, completely at the disposal of their legitimate master, in another, slaves represented the enemy within, against whom it was necessary to be constantly on guard. Certainly, to avert the threat, recourse could be had to terror, ruthlessly and even sadistically striking at guilty individuals and transforming execution into a kind of terrifying, educative spectacle for all the rest. The slaves in a particular area were obliged to witness the torment of two of their fellows, guilty of murder and condemned to be burnt alive. But that was not sufficient. Once again, preservation of the institution of slavery required heavy sacrifices even on the part of the dominant class. In 1741, in New York, mysterious fires fanned fears of a slave revolt. Condemned to death and burnt alive were two blacks, whose lives the master had in vain sought to save, testifying that at the time of the fire they were at home. Some years later, in the environs of the same city, a black, having confessed to setting fire to a barn, suffered the same torment. There was only one difference. The crowd of white spectators contrived to ensure that the flames were not extinguished too quickly, so that the spectacle and sufferings of the rebel black lasted as long as possible. His cries were heard 3 miles away. In any case, the master heard them very clearly. He sobbed loudly because his slave was dear to him. But he was powerless, and the most he could do was to see to it that the torture was not prolonged any further. Faced with the security requirements of the community they belonged to, individual slave owners could not demand free disposal over their property. Given the circumstances, these security requirements were a permanent given. We can make a general observation. Beginning of long quote. While the colonial slave codes seem at first sight to have been intended to discipline Negroes, to deny them freedoms available to other Americans, a very slight shift in perspective shows the codes in a different light. They aimed, paradoxically, at disciplining white men. Principally, the law told the white man, not the Negro, what he must do. The codes were for the eyes and ears of the slave owners. Sometimes the law required publication of the code in the newspaper, and that clergymen read it to their congregations. It was the white man who was required to punish his runaways, prevent assemblages of slaves, enforce the curfews, sit on special courts, and ride the patrols. End quote. Specific penalties were provided for slave owners who failed to inflict the punishments prescribed by law. According to a law in force in South Carolina, on her fourth attempt at flight, a female slave was to be, quote, severely whipped, branded on the left cheek with the letter R, and have her left ear cut off. End quote. Until 1722, it was the slave owners themselves who, directly or indirectly, had to provide for the execution of these operations. In crisis situations, the duty of vigilance made itself strongly felt. We have seen a military service of whites patrolling day and night in Richmond in 1831. In such cases, observed Gustave de Beaumont during his journey in de Tocqueville's company, quote, society arms itself with all its rigors and mobilizes all social forces, seeking in every possible way to encourage informing and control. In South Carolina, along with the fugitive slave, the death penalty awaited any person who has helped him in his escape. End quote. Significant, too, were the results of the passage of laws on fugitive slaves in 1850. Subject to punishment was not only the citizen who sought to hide or help the black pursued or sought by his legitimate owners, but also those who did not collaborate in his capture. This was a legal provision which, as its critics put it, sought to compel, quote, every freeborn American to become a manhunter. End quote. As well as slave owners, slave society ended up affecting the white community as a whole. Precisely because, in addition to being chattels, black slaves were also the enemy within. Abolitionists were immediately suspected of treason, thus becoming the target of a series of more or less harsh repressive measures, depending on the gravity of the impending danger. Severe restrictions were placed on the press. In 1800, the slave revolt in Virginia was often ignored by Southern newspapers. There was the danger of spreading the contagion of subversion further. In 1836, the President of the United States, Andrew Jackson, permitted the Postmaster General to block the circulation of all publications critical of the institution of slavery. Rounding off the gag placed on abolitionists, the House of Representatives adopted a resolution banning the extermination of anti-slavery petitions. Repression could take much more drastic forms. In 1805, denouncing writings liable to have an incendiary impact on slaves, South Carolina passed laws that provided for executing as traitors those who were in some way stained with the guilt of having stirred up a slave revolt or supported it. Georgia proceeded similarly. Bound up with terror from above was terror from below. While it took ruthless forms in the North, it aimed at preventing meetings and destroying the means of propaganda or the property of, quote, agitators. In the South, violence against abolitionists took the form of a pogrom that did not hesitate to torture and physically eliminate traitors and their supporters, with complete impunity. The situation in the South in the years preceding the Civil War was described as follows by Joel R. Poinsett, an important political figure in the Union, in a letter written by him at the end of 1850. Beginning of long quote. We are both, i.e. Poinsett and his correspondent, heartily sick of this atmosphere redolent of insane violence. There's a strong party averse to violent men and violent measures, but they are frightened into submission, afraid even to exchange opinions with others who think like them, lest they should be betrayed. End quote. In fact, the contemporary historian who cites this testimony concludes that, through recourse to lynching, violence and threats of every kind, The South succeeded in silencing not only any opposition, but also any mild dissent. In addition to abolitionists, those who wanted to distance themselves from this pitiless witch hunt felt threatened, and were threatened. They were impelled by terror into holding one's tongue, killing one's doubts, burying one's reservations. There is no doubt about it, the terroristic power wielded by slave owners over their blacks also ended up affecting, on a lasting basis, members and fractions of the dominant race and class. End of section.